A woman stood in a doorway while the world screamed. Behind the man on her threshold, there was nothing, only white, only the voice of a winter that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. He was the largest man in the valley. He had built the biggest ranch, spoken the loudest words, wielded the community's opinion like a tool. And now he stood at the door of the smallest cabin in the valley, trembling his cracked lips, moving around a single syllable. How? The woman looked at him. She had spent 5 months being pitied and mocked by men like him. She had spent 5 months being told she was wrong, that she was foolish, that she was chasing a dead man's dream down a hole in the ground. She stepped aside and let him in. But that moment was still 5 months away, and the answer to his question, an answer built from grief and physics, and the stubborn refusal of a woman who had nothing left to lose, had not yet been built. It existed only as a sketch in a dead man's journal, and a widow who had not yet found the courage to open the chest where it waited. The summer that preceded it was a beautiful liar. In a small valley tucked into the frontier wilderness of the American West, the air in those long August days spoke of warmth that would last forever. Dust moved in golden columns through the afternoon light. Grasshoppers sang in the tall, dry grass. The sky was a blue so deep and so still that it seemed impossible anything could ever come from the north to ruin it. Clara Marsh knew better. She was 28 years old, and she had already lived enough winters to understand that beauty in this part of the world was a mask. Behind it waited something patient and pitiless, a white annihilation that descended without apology and did not lift for months. The preparations for winter began in August, or they did not happen at all. She had $23 in a tin husk on the shelf, a 30-acre claim that fought back against every seed she tried to plant. A cabin her husband Daniel had built with his own hands, sturdy low to the ground, 4 walls of squared logs, and a cedar shake roof that kept out the rain but could not keep out the cold, not entirely. Not when the real cold came. She had a milk cow named Nell, 2 goats, 6 chickens, and a 6-year-old boy named Owen, who had his father's gray eyes and his father's quiet way of watching the world as though he were taking careful measurements of everything he saw. Daniel had been gone for just over a year. A collapse in the east shaft of the mine, what the foreman had called a geological event. A phrase that meant nothing and explained nothing had buried him and 2 other men under 1,000 tons of fractured rock. They had not recovered his body. There was no grave to visit. There was only an absence so vast it had its own gravity pulling everything in Clara's life toward a center that no longer existed. The previous winter had nearly killed her. She did not think about it often because thinking about it was like pressing on a burn. But the memory lived in her body, in the scar tissue across her palms, in the ache in her lower back that never fully left, in the way her breath caught sometimes when the wind shifted to the north. A blizzard had come without warning, and the world had become a white void. And Clara had spent 20 minutes crawling on her hands and knees through snowdrifts, searching blind for the rope she had strung between the cabin and the barn. When her hand finally closed around the ice-crusted hemp, she had made a sound she could not describe, something raw and animal that the wind tore away into nothing. She had survived. Owen had survived. Nell had survived barely after a lung fever that kept Clara sleeping in the freezing barn for 2 weeks, pressed against the cow's warm side. But luck was not a strategy, and winter always collected what it was owed. It was on a still August night, moths tapping softly against the window glass, the last heat of the day bleeding out of the log walls, that Clara finally opened the chest. It sat in the corner near the foot of the bed pine, and iron smelling of ink and resin. Daniel's chest. She had not been able to open it in the 14 months since his death. It contained the architecture of his thinking, the private landscape of a mind she had loved more than anything in the world, except the boy sleeping 10 feet away. To open it felt like opening something that should stay sealed. She lifted the lid anyway. The smell reached her first. Pine and iron and ink, and beneath those, something fainter. The ghost of his skin, the wool of his shirts, a scent so specific and so familiar that it bypassed every rational thought and went straight to the place behind her ribs where grief lived like a clenched fist. She turned the pages of his journals slowly. His handwriting was neat and angular, the letters formed with the precision of a man who measured things for a living. Daniel Marsh had not been merely a miner who knew how to handle dynamite and shore up a crumbling drift. He had been a student of the earth itself, of pressures and fissures and the strange, steady behavior of deep rock. He wrote about underground systems as living things. He wrote about ventilation and airflow. He wrote about the peculiar fact that once you descended below the frost line, the temperature of the earth became remarkably constant, a quiet, unwavering 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the sky was doing far above. And then she found the sketch. It was tucked near the back of the third journal, a drawing of a structure she had never seen before. A passage extending from a root cellar 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, lined with dry stacked stone covered with timber and earth. Below the sketch diagrams of airflow channels cut into the ground heat, moving in slow, patient loops through stone and soil. In the margin in Daniel's hand, 4 words, "The earth remembers summer." Clara's hands went still on the page. Below the sketch, folded and pressed flat between the pages, was something she had never seen. An envelope. Her name on the front. The date written in the upper corner the morning of the day he died. Her hands began to shake. She unfolded the letter carefully, as though the paper itself might dissolve. Clara, I have been thinking about the tunnel for weeks, and I believe I have finally solved it. The earth below the frost line holds a steady warmth year-round. We do not need to defeat the winter. We only need to go beneath it. A passage from the root cellar to the barn foundation 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, lined with dry stacked stone covered with timber and earth. The animals give heat. The earth stores it. The passage carries it. I will explain the mathematics when I come home tonight. Your Daniel. He had written those words. Then he had gone to the mine, and he had never come home to explain the mathematics. Clara sat with the letter against her chest for a very long time. The candle burned to a stub. The cabin grew cold around her, and she did not feel it. He had seen the answer. He had seen it months before he died, and he had trusted her, only her to understand it. She read the letter again, and then a third time. There was a sound from the small bed in the corner, Owen shifting in his sleep, one arm dropping over the edge of the mattress. Clara looked at her son, at his gray eyes closed in sleep, at the small, steady rise and fall of his breathing. She folded the letter and held it in both hands. Your father left us the answer, she said quietly. To no one to the dark, to the ghost of a man still somewhere deep in the mountain. We just have to dig. Outside the August night was warm and full of crickets, but somewhere to the north, already the cold was waiting. patient, certain, absolute. It did not know what was coming. The work began the next morning. Clara marked the line before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, a straight path from the root cellar entrance on the cabin's north side to the foundation stones of the barn. 100 feet. She drove the first stake into the ground with the heel of her boot, stretched the twine to the second, and stood back to look at what she had committed to. 100 feet of hard-packed clay and river rock. 100 feet that would need to become a passage 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, lined with stone, roofed with timber, covered with earth. A tunnel deep enough to run below the frost line, deep enough to reach the place where the ground kept its ancient, unwavering temperature. She picked up the shovel. She drove it into the earth. She felt the shock travel up through the handle and into her wrists and shoulders, and the ground gave back exactly as much as it intended to, which was very little. Owen stood at the edge of the marked line with his small wooden wagon waiting. He had appointed himself in charge of hauling the smaller stones to the pile forming at the yard's edge, a job he performed with the focused gravity of someone who understood even at 6 years old that the work they were beginning was not a game. They did not speak much that first morning. There was nothing to say that the work itself did not already know. By the end of the first week, Clara had cleared 20 feet of trench and reached a depth of 3 feet. Her hands were a map of blisters and cuts. Her lower back had gone from an ache to a constant specific argument that woke her in the night. She had developed a way of reading the ground, the clay that yielded to pressure the rock, that required the iron bar, and patience, the particular sound her shovel made when it struck something buried that was going to take time. She had also become, without seeking it, the subject of the valley's conversation. It was Herschel Pruitt who named it first. He ran the general store at the valley's crossroads, a compact, weathered man, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to question whether the world would make room for him. He stopped his wagon on the track that ran past Clara's property and leaned over the side to observe the narrow, ragged trench extending across her yard. "Putting in a new root cellar, Mrs. Marsh," he called. "Connecting it to the barn," Clara said without looking up. A pause. "Connecting it. What for?" "To walk, and for the air." Pruitt sat back and looked at the line of twine stretching across the yard, at the small woman standing waist-deep in the earth with dirt on her face and a rock the size of a boot in each hand. And he laughed. It was a short sound, not cruel exactly, but absolute in its dismissal, the laugh of a man encountering something too far outside his understanding to be taken seriously. "A man could build a whole cabin in the time it'll take you to dig that ditch," he said. "A simple rope line is all anyone needs come snow." He shook his head, flicked his reins, and drove on. Owen was standing at his wagon with 2 stones in his hands, watching the dust settle behind Pruitt's departing wheels. He looked at his mother. Why did he laugh? Clara drove the shovel into the earth again. "Because he's never seen anyone do this before. People laugh at things they haven't seen yet." Owen considered this in the way he considered most things, quietly, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. Did Papa laugh at things he hadn't seen yet? Clara looked at her son, at the gray eyes watching her with their patient, measuring steadiness. She felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she had kept carefully closed. "Papa is the one who drew the picture," she said. Owen nodded as though this settled something fundamental and went back to loading his wagon. He never asked again. By mid-September, the aspen trees on the high ridges had begun to turn. The first flecks of gold appeared in the green like warnings written in a language that everyone in the valley could read. The air carried a new edge, not cold, yet not exactly but purposeful, a reminder of what was coming. The name spread during those weeks, the way names do in small places, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Someone called it the Widow's Trench. Someone else called it Marsh's Folly. By the time the aspens were fully gold, it had settled into the latter, and the phrase was said with a particular quality of certainty that precedes events people have already decided will end badly. Clara heard it. She did not engage with it. She had too much ground left to dig. It was during those same weeks that Flint appeared. Owen found him at the dump at the valley's edge, a dog of indeterminate breed and unmistakable history, all jutting ribs and matted fur, with eyes the color of old honey and an expression of profound wariness that suggested the world had not, on the whole, treated him kindly. He was not aggressive. He was simply waiting for confirmation of what he had clearly come to expect, which was that no one would stay. Owen sat down in the dirt beside him and did not move for 20 minutes. When Clara came to collect her son for supper, she found the two of them in the dirt together. Owen cross-legged the dog with his bony head on Owen's knee, both of them watching the last of the evening light drain from the sky with identical expressions of quiet satisfaction. "Mama," Owen said. "His name is Flint." Clara looked at the dog. The dog looked at Clara with those honey-colored eyes steady, waiting, offering nothing and asking everything. "He's half-starved," Clara said. "So were we last February," Owen said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "One more mouth," she said finally. "He doesn't eat much." She looked at her son's face, at the particular quality of hope there careful, and contained the hope of a child who has learned not to ask for things too loudly, because loudness sometimes frightens them away. "Bring him in," she said. That night, Flint lay beside Owen's feet, and the boy slept straight through until morning. The first night in longer than Clara could remember that Owen had not called out in his sleep, reaching for something or someone he couldn't name. She stood in the doorway between the two rooms and looked at them for a long time. Then she went to bed. The crisis came on the 10th day of October. 3 days of cold rain had been unpleasant but manageable. Then the temperature dropped, the rain turned to sleet, and Clara opened the pantry to find that her calculations had been optimistic. The preserved meat was lower than she had thought. The grain was lower. The previous winter's near disaster had depleted her reserves more than she had admitted to herself, and the summer's work of digging the tunnel had left less time than usual for the patient, unglamorous work of filling the shelves. By the second day, she was rationing. By the third day, she was giving Owen her share and telling him she had already eaten. He believed her the first time. He was 6 years old. The second time, she could see in his face that he was not certain, but he was hungry enough to allow himself the kindness of uncertainty. On the third night, Owen woke with a fever. It came quickly, the way fevers come to children, from nothing to frightening inside of an hour. Clara pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin, and understood that this was not the mild warmth of a body fighting something small. This was the kind of fever that required a decision. The stove was burning low. She had been rationing wood as well as food, calculating the winter's supply against the winter's length with the grim arithmetic of a woman who has learned to count everything. She had 3 days' worth of wood left stacked neatly beside the stove. 3 matches left in the tin on the shelf. She had counted them that morning without meaning to the way you count things when you are frightened. She built the fire up. Owen needed warmth more than she needed a calculation. She sat beside him through the night, one hand on his chest to feel the rise and fall of his breathing, and she thought about what her father had told her about fever. That fever itself was not the enemy, that fever was the body fighting, that the enemy was what happened if the body stopped fighting before it won. She thought about the wild herbs she had seen growing in the creek bed, the ones her father had called fever breakers, and she thought about the fact that the creek was half a mile away in the dark and the cold. She was still thinking about it when Owen's breathing changed. It deepened, slowed. The terrible rhythm of high fever, shallow and fast, eased into something longer and cooler. By the time the gray light of morning came through the shuttered windows, the heat in his skin had dropped to something manageable. The crisis had passed on its own, the way crises sometimes do not because of anything you did, but because the body decided it was going to win. Clara sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that. She looked at her hands. She looked at the nearly empty pantry. She looked at the 3 matches in the tin. What if I am wrong about all of this? She said to no one. The question hung in the cold cabin air, and the only answer was the sound of Owen breathing alive and the quiet tick of the cooling stove. She got up. She went to the barn through the tunnel. She came back with milk for Owen when he woke, and she went back to digging. It was during the rebuilding of a collapsed section. The rains of mid-October had brought down 15 feet of careful stonework and buried the floor of the passage under a jumble of rock and mud that Silas Vane appeared. He came on horseback one gray afternoon, a broad-shouldered man of 36 with a quiet face and the economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years working in confined spaces underground. He was a miner by trade, or had been before the shaft he'd worked in the next valley over had played out. A widower. Clara had heard, though she did not know the details, and had not asked. He stopped his horse at the edge of the property and looked at the trench for a long time without speaking. "You set the stones dry," he said finally. "No mortar. Mortar cracks when the ground freezes and shifts," Clara said. "Dry stack moves with the pressure." He was quiet for a moment, still studying the walls with the focused attention of someone who recognized craft when he encountered it. "Like the old workings back home," he said. "Same principle." He came back 3 days later with a wagon load of straight pine planks salvaged from an abandoned mill building 2 valleys over that no one had touched in years. He stacked them beside the trench without ceremony, without conversation, without any apparent expectation of thanks. Then he stood at the edge for a while, watching Clara work. "The ventilation," he said. "How are you accounting for it?" Clara explained Daniel's calculations, the thermal mass of the stone walls, the convective loop that would draw cool air from the deep ground and precondition it before it reached the cabin the way the animal's body heat would feed the system rather than dissipate into a freezing barn. Silas listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The junction with the barn foundation. You'll want to angle the approach. Straight in, you'll get water pooling at the base every spring." He was right. She hadn't thought of it. He came back the following week and the week after that. Each visit was brief. He spoke only when he had something useful to say, and everything he said was useful. Owen observed all of this with the measuring gray eyes of his father, and one evening, watching Silas's horse disappear over the ridge, he said to Clara, "He fixes things that aren't broken, Mama." Clara was at the stove and did not turn around. "He's helping with the tunnel," she said. "He fixed the hinge on the barn door," Owen said. "The hinge wasn't broken." Clara said nothing, but her hands were very still on the pot she was holding. Nate Holt appeared on a Tuesday, the rancher's son, 17 years old, riding a horse too fine for a teenager and carrying himself with his father's broad shoulders and none of his father's granite certainty. He stood at the trench edge and studied the stonework in silence for a full minute before he said anything. "You angled the base courses," he said. "That's not in any building manual I've ever seen." "It came from watching what failed," Clara said. He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected. Then, "My father doesn't check the scrap pile behind the mill. There's good timber there. Dry straight. You could use it for the roof courses." Clara looked at him. She read the thing underneath the offer, the fear that belongs to a young person doing something they know the authority in their life would forbid. "If he finds out," she said, "he won't." He came back 2 days later with a full wagon of planks. He unloaded them without ceremony and stacked them neatly. Then he stood at the edge of the trench and watched, and the questions he began to ask were the questions of someone who had been waiting for permission to think in a particular direction. Clara answered each one directly. She showed him Daniel's sketches when he asked to see them. She explained the principles of thermal mass, of convective loops, of the difference between fighting cold and working with the Earth's own deep nature. Nate listened the way people listen when they are being given something they have been hungry for without knowing it. One afternoon, after a long silence, he said, "My father says books are a luxury." Clara drove a stone into place with her mallet. "Your father built the finest ranch in this valley with his own 2 hands. He was right about most things. He just hasn't needed books yet." She looked at the wall. "But there will come a time." Nate looked at her with something between gratitude and hunger, the look of a person told for the first time that what they want is not shameful. He left without another word. But he came back. The afternoon that Elias Holt arrived, the sky was the clear, hard blue of early autumn, and the air tasted of iron. He came on horseback, a large man on a large horse, sitting his saddle with the settled authority of someone for whom the landscape below him has always been subject to his assessment. He was the most successful rancher in the valley, a man who had built an empire from nothing through sheer force of will, and whose opinions on how things should be done carried the weight of law in a place without much of the formal kind. He did not dismount. He looked down at Clara from the full height of his authority, and his voice when he spoke was not unkind. It was something worse than unkind. It was certain. "Mrs. Marsh, you are engaged in a great and terrible folly. You are spending your strength and your daylight digging a grave when you should be stacking wood. The community is concerned. I am concerned." Clara shielded her eyes from the sky and looked up at the dark silhouette of him against the light. She said nothing. "A widow and her child have a claim on our charity," Holt continued. "But we cannot help those who will not help themselves in a practical manner. This," he gestured at the trench with one broad hand, "is not practical. It is a hole in the ground. It will fill with snow. It will collapse. It will draw damp and cold into your home." Clara straightened. She leaned on the iron bar and looked at the wall she had spent weeks building. "I have enough wood, Mr. Holt," she said. "This is also winter work." He made a short sound of dismissal. "I am advising you, for the sake of your boy, to stop this. Fill it in. Spend your remaining good weather on preparations that have been proven to work." Clara looked at the smooth stone she had set that morning. She pressed her palm against it. It was cool to the touch, not the sharp cold of air, but the different temperature of something that had been undisturbed in the ground for a very long time. Something that operated by rules older than the frost. "The cold is not only in the wind," she said quietly. "It's in the ground too. But so is the warmth. The same earth that freezes the surface hold it deep enough, and it never lets go of summer." Elias Holt stared at her. She could see it in his face, the bafflement, the frustration, the inability of a man who had built everything he owned from conventional wisdom to process a statement that existed outside the framework of everything he knew. He did not see an engineer. He saw a grieving woman building a monument to a dead man's idea. And then he said the thing that Clara had not prepared for. "I will speak to Reverend Cade," he said, and his voice had gone flat and final. "The boy needs to be in the care of someone with sound judgment." The words struck her in the stomach like a physical blow. She felt them drop through her, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settling into the place where a mother's deepest fears live like a second heartbeat. She gripped the iron bar. She watched Elias Holt turn his horse and ride away without looking back. She stood in the trench for a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Flint appeared at the edge above her and lay down his chin on his paws, watching her face. What Clara did not know, what the valley did not know, because Elias Holt had never spoken of it, not once in 20 years, was this: before the big ranch. Before the largest woodpile in the valley, before the massive stone fireplace and the tightest jointed walls anyone had ever built in that part of the country, there had been a winter. The first winter when his claim was raw and his cabin was still half finished, and the cold had come in through the gaps in the logs like water through a sieve. He had a daughter then. Her name was Lily. She was 3 years old, with blonde curls and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. The fever had taken her in 4 days. Holt had buried her himself in frozen ground with a shovel and a pickaxe in a grief so enormous that it had reshaped the geography of his soul. And after that, he had built. He had built with a fury that bordered on madness, thicker walls, tighter joints, a chimney 18 feet tall. A woodpile that was a monument to foresight. He had built his homestead into a fortress because a fortress was the only answer he had ever found to the question Lily's death had asked him: how do you keep the people you love alive? When he looked at Clara Marsh digging her trench, he did not see a woman with a plan. He saw a mother gambling with her child's life on an unproven idea. And the sight of it touched something in him that was 20 years old and still raw and still unbearable. His cruelty was not cruelty. It was the echo of a buried grief thrown forward across 2 decades onto a woman he could not allow himself to understand. That night was the hardest. Owen was asleep. The cabin was dark and quiet, and Clara sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and let herself feel the full weight of what Elias Holt had said. If the tunnel failed, if the winter proved it useless, if she could not keep the cabin warm and the animals alive, Reverend Cade would come. And the next time he came, he would not come with a polite inspection and a carefully worded warning. He would come with the authority of the church council and the full crushing weight of community consensus, and he would take Owen. The calculation was simple and terrible. If she gave up now, Owen would be safe and warm under someone else's roof. If she continued and failed, she would lose him anyway, but she would lose him to her own stubborn refusal to listen. She put her hand on the lid of Daniel's chest. She sat there for a long time, pressing her palm against the pine wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers. Chasing a dead man's dream. That was what Marta Gould had called it. The woman who had once been the closest thing Clara had to a friend in this valley, who had since begun distancing herself with the careful caution of someone preserving their social standing. The phrase had found the place where doubt lived and curled up there and refused to leave. Was that what she was doing? Building a tunnel or building a monument, honoring Daniel's mind or hiding inside it? Flint padded over from his place by the wall and lay down against her feet. The warmth of him was small, but specific and real. From the corner of the room, barely above silence, "Mama." Owen was not fully awake. He was speaking from the border of sleep eyes still closed, face soft. "Papa wouldn't want us to stop," he said. Would he? It was not quite a question. Clara looked at her son, at the gray eyes closed behind their lids, at the small chest rising and falling. She did not answer. She sat with the words until they settled through her past the doubt, past the cold calculation, past the fear, and found something underneath that had been there all along, quiet and unchanged. She took her hand off the chest lid. She went to bed. In the morning, she dug. The rains came in the middle of October, a cold, relentless downpour that lasted 2 full days, turning the yard to a lake of brown water and sending streams down the hillside into every low point on the property. On the morning of the 3rd day, Clara walked out to the trench and found 15 feet of wall collapsed. The section near the midpoint where the earth above was deepest and the drainage was poorest had simply given way. The weight of the waterlogged soil had pushed inward, shoving the carefully stacked stones off their foundations and burying the floor of the passage under a jumble of rock and mud. 6 days of labor gone. Clara stood at the edge and looked down into the ruin of her work. She did not curse. She did not cry. She sat down at the edge of the trench, her legs hanging over the side, her hands in her lap. Owen's small boots made soft sounds in the mud behind her. He appeared at her side, looked down into the collapsed section, looked at her face, and sat down too. Right in the mud without a word. Flint lay down on the other side of Clara, his warm flank against her leg. They sat together for a long time. 2 figures at the edge of a ruined trench, a dog between them and the space around them was not empty. It was full of something that didn't need words. Then Owen spoke. "Mama, did Papa ever have a cave-in before the last one?" Clara looked at her son. She understood what he was really asking, not about geology, about failure, about whether the man who had drawn the blueprint for the thing now buried in mud had ever been beaten by the earth before. "Yes," she said. "Many times. Mines collapse. It's what they do." "What did Papa do?" The question hung in the morning air. Clara looked at the collapsed wall. She looked at her hands. "He dug again," she said. She stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron and climbed back down into the mud. She rebuilt the collapsed section over the following 5 days, but she did not rebuild it the same way. As she cleared the rubble and relaid the foundation stones, she studied the failure, reading the pattern of the collapse the way Daniel would have read it, tracing the path the water had taken, understanding why this section had given way when the others held. The base had been too narrow, the walls too vertical, the drainage inadequate. She widened the foundation by 6 inches on each side. She angled the walls outward by a few degrees, a subtle lean that would distribute the lateral pressure of expanding frozen soil across a broader surface. She dug a shallow channel alongside the footing, packed it with gravel, and created a path for water to drain away rather than pooling behind the stones. She did not consult Daniel's journals for these modifications. There were no diagrams for what she was doing. This was her own engineering born from observation and failure, and the refusal to be beaten twice by the same problem. Daniel had drawn the blueprint. The rain had tested it. Clara had improved it. When the last stone was set and she stood back to look at what she had built, the wall was stronger than what had come before. It was better. And it was hers. The tunnel was completed on a still evening in mid-October under a sky the color of pewter. Clara took Owen's hand and led him down the stone steps from the root cellar into the mouth of the passage. She held the lantern high. The air inside was cool and still and carried the smell of damp earth and something older beneath it, the mineral patience of deep ground. The light moved across the dry stack walls in a slow dance, and their shadows stretched long and wavering behind them. Owen whispered the way children always whisper underground, as though the space itself asks for a different kind of voice. "It's like being inside Papa's mountain." Clara squeezed his hand. They walked the full 100 feet. Their footsteps were soft on the packed earth floor, and the silence around them was complete, sealed away from the sky and the wind and everything that had been trying to kill them for the past year. They emerged in the barn. Nell turned her great head and blinked at them with her calm, dark eyes. The goats bleated their indifferent greeting. The chickens shifted on their roosts. The air was cool, but alive with the warmth of the animals, and the water in the trough was liquid. Flint pushed past them, trotted to the center of the barn floor, and sat down with an expression of profound self-satisfaction. His tail swept the hay in a slow, contented arc. Owen laughed. It was the first time Clara had heard him laugh in months. The sound filled the barn the way sunlight fills a room when someone throws open a curtain, sudden and complete and impossible to be unmoved by. She stood in the lantern light and listened to it, and something cracked open inside her chest that had been sealed shut since the day they told her Daniel wasn't coming home. Later, after Owen was in bed, she opened the chest one more time. She turned to the last page of the third journal, the only page still blank, the page where Daniel's hand had never written, and she wrote in her own. "Tunnel complete. Daniel." I dug again. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest. Outside, the first thin edge of real cold had arrived on the evening air. The season was turning. Everything was in place. And 3 days later, Marta Gould came to the door with a warning that changed everything. She had walked 2 miles through ankle-deep early snow, and she was breathing hard, and she did not come inside. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her face carrying the expression of someone delivering a verdict they had hoped they would not have to deliver. Clara. Reverend Cade spoke to the church council last Sunday. He told them if you and Owen are found in distress at the end of winter, he will formally request that the boy be placed with another family. She paused. Elias Holt spoke in support. When Elias speaks, people nod. Clara felt the porch boards tilt beneath her feet. I argued against it, Marta continued. I told them you were managing, but... Her eyes did not quite meet Clara's. I wanted you to know. Clara looked at the woman who had once been the closest thing she had to a friend in this valley. She saw the full shape of what had happened Marta, who had told her to stop digging, who had gone to Cade with her worries, who had lit the match and was now standing on her porch, warning her about the fire. It was not malice. It was something worse than malice. It was the damage done by people who lack the courage to be either fully kind or fully honest, and so become something in between that helps no one. Thank you for telling me, Clara said. Marta nodded once and turned back into the snow. Clara stood on the porch until she disappeared. Then she went inside and sat down beside the trap door in the floor, the door that led to the tunnel that led to the barn, the system that was either going to save her family or lose them everything. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to bed. Everything now depended on 100 feet of stone and silence, and on whether the earth would keep the promise Daniel had always believed it would. The betting list appeared on the board outside Pruitt's General Store on a gray morning in early November. It was written in Pruitt's own hand on a piece of brown paper tacked up between the notices for the upcoming church potluck and a lost mule. The heading read in large letters, Marsh's Folly Settlement Pool. Below it, 2 columns. The left column listed names, 12 of them, most of the men in the valley, and a few of the women. The right column listed dates. Before the first snow. Before Thanksgiving. Before Christmas. Before the New Year. The premise was simple. Everyone had picked the date by which Clara Marsh's tunnel project would be visibly abandoned, collapsed, or proven useless. The prize was a modest collection of coins and traded goods. The tone was not vicious. That was the worst part. The tone was jovial, neighborly, the kind of light cruelty that does not recognize itself as cruelty because everyone is laughing. Owen saw it. He had gone to Pruitt's with Clara to trade 2 jars of preserved gooseberries for a spool of wire, and he was standing at the board while Clara spoke with Pruitt at the counter. He read slowly the way 6-year-olds read, moving his lips, slightly, sounding out the longer words, arriving at understanding 1 syllable at a time. Clara saw his face before she saw the list. She read it in a single glance. She felt the heat rise in her chest, quick and sharp, and then it passed through her and left behind only the vast cold patience that had become her default weather. She had been surviving this valley's opinion of her for months. A piece of paper changed nothing about the physics, but Owen's face. He looked at her with his father's gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, "They think you're going to fail." "Yes," Clara said. "Are you—" She looked at her son. At the careful stillness of his expression, the effort of a child holding something fragile, not wanting to drop it. "Your father bet on the earth," she said, "and the earth kept its promise." She took the wire from the counter and put it in her basket. "Come on." They walked home in the thin, early winter light, Flint moving ahead of them on the track, nose down, reading the ground. Owen did not speak again until they reached the yard, until he could see the low grass-covered mound that marked the tunnel's path from cabin to barn. The gentle spine of packed earth that ran across the yard like a seam invisible from a distance, meaning everything up close. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the handle of his small wagon and went to fill it with stones for the drainage channel Clara was still improving. She watched him go, and she understood that the list had not broken anything in him. It had confirmed something, the same thing it had confirmed in her. That they were on one side of a line, and the valley was on the other, and the only way across was through the winter. It was Silas Vane who brought her the paper. He came on a clear afternoon, 2 weeks after the betting list appeared, riding in from the direction of the old mine workings in the adjacent valley. He dismounted at the fence and came to where Clara was reinforcing the final section of the tunnel's drainage channel, and he held out a folded piece of paper. "Found this in the record room at the old works," he said. "I was clearing equipment for the new owners." Clara took it. She unfolded it. It was a copy, not the original, but a careful reproduction in an unfamiliar hand of a diagram she knew. The same diagram, the same passage, sketched in cross-section, the same airflow arrows, the same notations about thermal mass and frost line depth. Daniel's drawing, filed in the administrative records of the mine where Daniel had worked before his death. Below the diagram, a note in the same unfamiliar hand proposal reviewed, "Impractical, not to be pursued." And beneath that, a date several years before Daniel's death and a signature she did not recognize. Clara stood very still looking at the paper. Daniel had not simply dreamed up the tunnel in the months before he died. He had proposed it formally. He had brought it to the people who ran the mine and laid out his calculations and his careful, thorough understanding of how the Earth's own deep temperature could protect the people who lived on its surface. And they had dismissed it, impractical, filed it away, forgotten it. He had gone home and said nothing. He had kept the idea in his journals, refined it, written the letter to Clara on the morning of the day the shaft took him. He had not told her about the rejection because he had not wanted the institution's dismissal to become her doubt. He had trusted her to see what they could not. He had protected the idea from other people's failure of imagination until she was ready to receive it on its own terms. She had been the only person he trusted to understand. Clara folded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket. She pressed her hand flat against it for a moment. "Thank you," she said to Silas. He nodded. He looked at the tunnel mound crossing the yard, the low, unassuming ridge of earth that contained beneath it everything. "He was right," Silas said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "He was." Silas looked at her for a moment, and then he looked away at the horizon, and there was something in his profile, something careful and unfinished that Clara did not examine too closely. Not yet. The signs came on a Tuesday. The morning had been unremarkable. A thin layer of new snow on the ground, the kind that crunches underfoot like paper, a sky the flat white of old bone. Clara was working in the root cellar when she noticed Flint. He was pacing, not the idle, restless pacing of a bored animal. This was something else. He moved from the cabin door to the window, back to the door, to the far corner, back again. A tight, repetitive circuit that he had been running for the better part of an hour. His ears were high and forward. Every few minutes he stopped, lifted his nose, and stood completely still in a way that was not calm, but its opposite, the absolute stillness of an animal reading something in the air that had no human name. Clara went to the window and looked at the sky. It was unchanged, white and flat and silent, nothing she could point to. But her ears felt odd. A faint pressure, subtle like the beginning of a change in altitude. And the light there was something wrong with the light, a faint yellowish cast to the gray that made the shadows look bruised. She went to the barn through the tunnel. Nell was not eating. The goats were pressed into the far corner of their pen, their usual belligerence absent, their eyes moving constantly. She went back to the cabin. "Owen," she said, "stay inside today." Then she put on her coat. She went first to Pruitt's store. "There's a storm coming," Clara said. "A bad one. I think people need to know." Pruitt set down his ledger. His expression shifted not to alarm, but to the measured, unhurried tolerance of a man who has never had to take a woman's warning seriously. "Sky's clear enough," he said. "The sky looked clear before the last bad one, too," Clara said. "My animals have been unsettled since this morning. The light is wrong. The pressure in my ears changed about 2 hours ago." "Animals get unsettled for all kinds of reasons, Mrs. Marsh. Could be a fox nearby." "Could be," Clara said. "But I'd rather tell people and be wrong than say nothing." He nodded slowly in the way that means I hear you, and I'm going to do nothing about this. She left without arguing. There was nothing left to argue. She had said what she came to say, and the saying was the only part she could control. She went next to Reverend Cade, who received her in the small parlor off the church Bible on the table beside him, hands folded. He listened to what she said with the attentive, slightly sorrowful expression of a man who takes seriously his duty to hear everyone out. "The Lord governs the seasons," he said when she had finished. If a great storm were coming, he would give warning in his own way and time. "He may be giving it now," Clara said, "through every animal in my barn." Cade smiled gently. "I appreciate your concern for the community, Mrs. Marsh. I will pray for continued mild weather." Clara left. She crossed the valley to the Holt Ranch. A farmhand at the gate told her Mr. Holt was not receiving visitors. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the house, the largest, most solid structure in the valley, with its thick log walls and its massive chimney and its monument of stacked firewood, and she thought of whatever it was inside Elias Holt that had made him build a fortress instead of listening. She turned and walked back. The last stop was Old Cutter's place, a small, rough homestead at the very edge of the valley where the land began to rise toward the high ridges. Old Cutter was a solitary man, somewhere past 60, who had worked this valley longer than anyone, and who had established over decades a reputation for knowing more than everyone else about most things. He was the one who had first called Clara the Mole Woman. His was the largest handwriting on Pruitt's betting list. He was splitting firewood in his yard when Clara arrived. He straightened when he saw her and leaned on his splitting axe with an expression of theatrical amusement. "The Mole Woman," he said. "Come to tell me my chickens are nervous?" "My cattle aren't eating," Clara said. "The light has a yellow cast to it. Something in the air has been changing since this morning." Old Cutter laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not malicious, simply the laughter of a man who has lived long enough to find the world reliably entertaining. "Mrs. Marsh, I have been watching the weather in this valley for 40 years. There is nothing coming today that hasn't come 100 times before." He picked up his axe. "You go home and tend your tunnel." Clara looked at him for a moment. There was something she could see in his face, not ignorance exactly, but the blindness of a man who had been right so many times that the possibility of being wrong had ceased to feel real to him, confidence calcified into certainty, experience that had stopped learning. "I hope you're right," she said. She walked back down the track toward home. Behind her, she could hear old Cutter resume splitting wood, the sharp rhythmic crack of the axe steady, and unhurried the sound of a man who has no doubt about what tomorrow will look like. As she passed the front of Pruitt's store, a group of young men lounging on the porch called out to her, "Hey, Tunnel Woman, is the Mole Woman scared of sunshine?" The others laughed. Clara did not break her stride. She did not turn around. She walked with the same measured pace she had used for the last hour, crossing the valley floor toward her cabin, her eyes on the horizon to the north. She had been watching it all afternoon, and now in the last of the afternoon light she could see it. The sky was still white and flat to the south and east and west. But to the north, at the very edge of the visible world where the valley ended and the high ridges began, there was something that had not been there an hour ago. A darkness, not the gradual darkening of evening. This was different. This was a wall. A solid advancing darkness that sat on top of the hills like a weight being lowered. Clara watched it for a moment. Then she went home. She moved through the cabin with the calm, efficient speed of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at the necessary conclusion. Owen understood from the quality of her movement that this was a different kind of evening. He packed his slate and his soldiers without being asked. Clara banked the stove. She checked the water barrel full. She pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed over the windows and dropped the crossbar into place. She brought in the last of the firewood from the porch stack and arranged it by the stove. She checked the trap door, verified the tunnel was clear, went through to the barn and made sure the animals had full feed and water and came back. She was at the stove when it came. Not gradually. Not the way ordinary weather arrives building and strengthening over time. It came all at once as though the world to the north had simply stopped existing and had been replaced with something else entirely. A roar. Not the whistle of ordinary wind, but something deeper. A sound in the chest, more than in the ears. A vibration that hit the walls of the cabin and shook the iron of the stove fittings and rattled the crossbar on the shutters. The temperature did not decline. It fell 10 degrees and then 10 more in a matter of minutes, as though a door had been opened between the valley and the void that lay beyond the top of the world. Owen looked up from the floor where he was arranging his soldiers. "Is it a bad one, Mama?" Clara stood at the stove and looked at the trap door in the floor. She thought of the tunnel beneath it, the 100 feet of dry stacked stone and packed earth and gravel drainage that she had built over months with her bleeding hands and her aching back and her dead husband's vision and her own hard-won improvements. The patient underground architecture that connected her world to her animals and through them to survival. "A very bad one," she said, "but we are ready." The wind hit the cabin like a fist. The walls shuddered. The shutters bucked against their crossbars. A thin white line of powder appeared at the bottom of the door and began to grow, and outside the world ceased to exist. What followed was 3 days and 3 nights of a kind of weather that does not feel like weather at all. It feels like a decision, like the sky has made up its mind about something and is carrying it through without compromise. Inside the large, well-built house of Elias Holt, the battle had already been lost before the end of the first night. He simply didn't understand that yet. The massive fireplace in the main room consumed wood at a rate that made his jaw tight every time he opened the box, the great stone hearth roaring with the full force of a well-seasoned fire, throwing heat across the room in a broad, hot wave. He stood before it and felt the heat on his face, and believed because he had to that the fire would be enough. But the wind found the gaps, not because his craftsmanship was poor. His craftsmanship was superb. But wood moves. Logs settle and shift and breathe with temperature. And no amount of careful chinking can prevent the microscopic paths that cold finds in the dark. Because cold is not looking for a gap. It is simply moving the way water moves, taking whatever path is available. Fine snow forced through the seams around the window frames, building small white crescents on the sills. Drafts ran along the floor, cold air pooling at ankle height, creeping upward. The hemisphere of tolerable warmth in front of the hearth shrank by imperceptible degrees, and the room beyond it grew colder. His wife Catherine moved their 2 young sons into the warm zone and wrapped them in every blanket they owned. She did not complain. Catherine never complained. But Holt could see it in her face that she was afraid. Nate sat in the corner farthest from the fire, wrapped in a horse blanket, having given his coat to his younger brother without being asked. He was watching his father with an expression Holt did not look at directly. By the second morning, the woodpile outside was nearly unreachable. Holt had made 2 trips on the first day, brutal gasping expeditions through waist-deep drifts, the wind hitting him sideways. He came back each time carrying as much as his arms could hold. The wood he brought back was not enough. He began to ration it. The fire burned lower. The warmth shrank further. And that second night, his youngest son, not yet 4, began to cough. It was a thin, dry, rhythmic sound, not alarming in itself, but in the context of the shrinking fire and the cold advancing across the floor and the wind that would not stop each cough was a cable being wound around a drum inside Elias Holt's chest. He had not thought about Lily in years. He had built an elaborate internal architecture specifically to avoid thinking about Lily walls of activity and authority and the forward momentum of daily work so thick and so carefully maintained that the room where she lived had been sealed for 2 decades. The cold dissolved those walls. In the dark of the second night, with the fire guttering and his sick son coughing, and his wife holding the boy against her chest, the door to that room opened. He saw her, 3 years old. Blonde curls stuck to her forehead with fever sweat. The small body that had weighed nothing in his arms when he carried her to the grave he had hacked out of frozen ground. He had spent 20 years building a fortress because he believed a fortress would be the answer. Because if he built it high enough and thick enough and stacked the wood deep enough, he would never again have to dig in frozen ground. The fire was dying. The wood was nearly gone. The wind was winning. And Elias Holt, sitting in the shrinking circle of warmth in the house he had built to be unbreakable, understood for the first time in 20 years that he had been answering the wrong question. The question had never been, how do you build walls strong enough to keep the cold out? The cold didn't respect walls. It found the gaps. It always found the gaps. He thought of the betting list on Pruitt's board. He thought of the words he had delivered from horseback like a verdict. He thought of Clara Marsh. His stomach dropped. If his fortress had failed, then what had become of her? What had become of the boy? The guilt and the fear arrived simultaneously and tangled together into a single weight he could not separate and did not try to. He looked at Nate across the dying fire. His son was already looking back at him. Inside Clara's cabin, a candle burned on the table. Its flame did not move. The cabin was warmer than it had any right to be, not the sharp, localized heat of a roaring fire, but a diffuse, even warmth that seemed to come from the structure itself, from the floor and the walls and the very air. The temperature was not tropical, but it was consistent, and consistency was everything. Owen sat on the floor near the stove, not pressed against it in desperation, but simply near it, comfortable enough to play arranging his wooden soldiers into formations that only he fully understood. Flint lay beside him, with his chin on his paws, exhaling long, satisfied breaths that moved his whole body. Every so often, Owen would shift a soldier and Flint would open one eye, assess the change, and close it again. Clara sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk and listened to the storm. She could hear it. Through the shuttered windows and the thick log walls, she could hear the deep, continuous roar of it, the voice of a winter that had finally decided to be honest about what it was. She had been listening to it for 2 days now, and she had stopped being frightened of it sometime in the middle of the first night. Not because it had diminished, because she had realized that the thing she had built was holding. Every few hours she descended through the trap door, walked the 100 feet of tunnel, and tended the animals. The passage was cool and still and smelled of earth. Her footsteps were soft on the packed floor. The stone walls stood exactly as she had built them. The barn, when she emerged from the tunnel's far end, was cold but livable. Nell's eyes were calm. The goats had pressed together companionably. The chickens had arranged themselves on their roost with the focused efficiency of creatures who had decided that warmth was primarily a collective project. Clara milked Nell, refreshed the feed, broke the thin crust of ice on the trough water, a thin crust, not the solid block she had spent her previous winter battling every morning, and walked back through the tunnel to the cabin. She heated the milk. She poured some for Owen. The simple act felt almost unbearable in its luxury. Somewhere in the valley, people were burning their furniture. And here, a woman was warming milk. It was somewhere in the second night, long after Owen had fallen asleep, long after Flint had shifted from beside Owen to beside Clara's feet, that she heard it. A faint, irregular tapping like a fingernail against glass coming from somewhere below. She lit the lantern. She opened the trap door. She went down. The tunnel was dark and still. She walked slowly, holding the lantern low, watching the walls. Halfway along, she found it a thin trickle of water running down the stone at the joint where the tunnel met the barn's foundation. Not much. A thread barely wider than a pencil. In summer, it would have been nothing. But this was not summer. Water in this cold was a weapon. If it seeped into the gaps between the foundation stones and froze, the expansion would crack the wall apart from the inside, slow, irresistible final. Clara set the lantern on the floor. She traced the path the water was taking, following a hairline gap in the barn's original mortared foundation. Old work, not hers. The mortar crumbled with age and the pressure of the storm above. The trickle pulsed with the wind driven by the pressure changes, and each pulse left behind a thin glaze of ice beginning to form on the stone face. She went back to the cabin. She gathered what she needed: strips of hide, a bucket of clay-dry straw. She carried them back down into the tunnel and went to work. It was meticulous work, quiet work. She pressed the hide strips deep into the gap with her fingers, a flexible seal that could move with the freezing and thawing without cracking. She mixed the clay with straw and applied it in thin, careful layers, smoothing each one flush, with the surrounding stone building up the patch with the patience of someone who understood that the difference between success and catastrophic failure was being measured right now in millimeters. 2 hours. When she finished, the trickle had stopped. The patch was holding. She sat down on the tunnel floor with her back against the wall. Her hands were coated with clay. Her fingers were numb. Her back ached from crouching in the tight space. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside her and held it there. She had come to know this temperature over months of building not the sharp cold of air, not the warmth of fire, but something older than both. Something that had been here before the first frost and would be here after the last. The Earth's own resting state, which had nothing to do with the chaos happening above it. She thought about Daniel. She had spent the year since his death carrying him the way you carry a wound pressed against it, afraid to loosen the pressure. Afraid that letting go meant admitting it was real. She had carried his absence as though it were something she owed him, as though grief were a form of loyalty. But sitting in the tunnel in the dark, with the storm raging in the world above, and the earth holding steady in the world below, Clara felt something shift, slowly, the way a season turns not in a moment, but over days so gradually that you don't notice it until you realize the light is different. She was not carrying Daniel anymore. She was standing on the foundation he had laid. The foundation was solid, and she had built something real on top of it, something that was keeping her son alive, something that had come from his vision and her hands, and the long, painful process of learning through failure to make something better than the original blueprint. She missed him. She would always miss him. But the missing was not a wound anymore. It was a warmth, low and steady, like the temperature of the earth itself. She picked up her lantern. She walked back through the tunnel. She climbed the stone steps. She lay down beside her sleeping son, and Flint settled against her feet, and the storm pressed against the walls of the cabin and did not get in. And Clara Marsh slept the deepest sleep she had known in more than a year. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. It did not taper. It stopped as though someone had closed a valve, cutting off the supply of wind and fury, with a suddenness that was almost violent in its own right. One moment the walls were shuddering and the shutters were straining against their crossbars, and the world outside was a continuous, featureless white scream. And then it wasn't. Then there was only silence, a silence so absolute and so complete that it felt like a physical substance, something you could press your hands into and feel the resistance of. Clara opened the shutters. The light hit her like a blow. The sky was a blue so deep and so clear, it seemed manufactured, the kind of blue that exists only after violence, when the air has been scoured clean of everything soft. The snow was blinding, pure white, generating its own light, reflecting the sun with an intensity that turned the whole valley into a single blazing plain. Drifts had built against every vertical surface, smooth sculpted forms, 10 and 15 feet high, in places shaped by the wind into curves and ridges that looked almost intentional. The valley was unrecognizable, and it was utterly, completely still. Owen appeared at her elbow. He looked out at the transformed world with a gray-eyed assessment of his father. It stopped, he said. Yes. Did everyone stay warm? Clara looked out at the white stillness. At the smoke rising from the chimneys, she could see some of them, not all of them. We'll find out, she said. The knock came an hour later. She heard it through the silence, a dull, muffled impact against the cabin door, the sound of a gloved fist hitting wood, with less force than intended, as though the person delivering it had used up most of their strength getting here. Clara opened the door. Elias Holt stood on her threshold. He was barely recognizable as the man who had sat his horse above her and delivered verdicts like weather. The large authoritative frame was still there, but everything else had been stripped away by 4 days of a cold that had been trying to teach him something. His beard was a frozen mask. The skin of his face was a patchwork of red and pale that spoke of cold, endured past the point of comfort and into the territory of genuine danger. His hands inside their gloves were trembling. Behind him, Nate stood in the snow. The boy's face was red and set with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through. Elias Holt looked at Clara. He looked at Owen sitting on the floor behind her, healthy and warm, arranging his soldiers in the morning light. He looked at the candle on the table, burning with its unwavering steadiness. He felt the warmth reach his frozen face like water. Not the sharp, desperate warmth of proximity to flame, but something diffuse and even and deeply present, a warmth that rose from the walls, the floor, the very air of the cabin. His cracked lips moved around the word that had been building in him since the dark of the second night. How? Clara looked at the man who had threatened to take her son. She saw the bewilderment underneath the remnants of his certainty, raw and genuine, the bewilderment of someone encountering a reality that has no place in the framework they built their life around. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Flint, standing at her heel, gave a single low sound, not aggressive, simply noting. Then he made some private assessment and stepped back to let Elias Holt pass. Holt moved into the cabin slowly. He stood just inside the door and felt the warmth settle around him. He looked around the room, at the small stove with its single modest fire, at the ordinary walls, at the trap door in the floor, its edges worn smooth by the passage of many feet. His eyes stopped at the trap door. He looked at Clara. "Show me," he said. His voice was not the voice he had used from horseback. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he doesn't understand, asking to be led rather than to lead. Clara lit a lantern. She opened the trap door. She descended the stone steps into the root cellar and then into the mouth of the passage, and she heard Elias Holt follow her down. Nate came last. She could hear his hand trailing along the wall the way a person touches something they want to understand through the skin of their palms. They walked the tunnel in silence. The lantern light moved across the dry stack walls, illuminating the careful placement of each stone. The flat faces outward, the courses staggered, the subtle outward angle of the walls that Clara had engineered after the rain had taught her what vertical couldn't withstand. The gravel drainage channel at the base, the hide and clay patch near the barn junction still holding still sound. Elias Holt walked slowly. He breathed. He felt the temperature of the air so different from the killing cold he had spent 4 days fighting, so different from the desperate, shrinking warmth of his dying fire. He placed his bare hand against the earth wall and held it there. The wall did not fight him. It did not push back. It simply was neutral, patient, holding a temperature that had nothing to do with the violence above. Something in his face changed. The granite set of his jaw softened. The rigid line of his shoulders dropped. The mask of 20 years of absolute certainty began slowly to dissolve. Clara did not watch it directly. She kept walking, holding the lantern steady. They emerged in the barn. Nell turned and blinked at them. The goats looked up with mild interest. The chickens murmured on their roosts. The water in the trough was liquid, a thin skim of ice at the edges, nothing more. The air was cool, but livable. Elias Holt stood in the barn and looked at the living animals and the liquid water and the cool, manageable air. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned to Clara and said, "Teach me the principle." They sat at Clara's table, Elias and Nate across from her Daniel's journal open between them. Clara explained quietly, without condescension and without triumph. She laid out the physics as Daniel had laid them out for her, and as she had come to understand them through months of building and failing and rebuilding. Thermal mass, geothermal stability, convective loops, the fundamental flaw of the open fireplace, the way it consumed air, created draft, pulled cold in through every gap while sending heat up the chimney to warm the sky. Elias listened. He listened the way a man listens when he has finally stopped talking with his whole body, with the full attention of a mind that has been cracked open by reality, and is now for the first time in a very long time genuinely empty enough to receive something new. Nate listened with a pencil, making small sketches on a scrap of paper, the tunnel cross-section, the airflow arrows, the junction with the barn foundation. His hand moved with a precision and an ease that was quietly startling. When Clara finished and closed the journal, Elias sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped. He did not turn around. He stood with his back to Clara and one hand on the doorframe, and he spoke to the wood. "I threatened to take your boy," he said. His voice was low and stripped of everything that had ever made it commanding. "I told Cade to watch you. I set him on you like a dog." A pause. "That is the worst thing I have ever done to another human being." The cabin was very still. Owen had stopped arranging his soldiers. He was watching the large man at the door with his father's gray eyes quiet, measuring, taking in everything. Flint lay near the stove without moving, but his amber eyes were open. Clara looked at Elias Holt. She saw the stiffness in his back, the way his shoulders were held braced as though he expected the impact of a blow. She saw beneath the weathered exterior, beneath the remnants of his pride, the shape of a grief that was 20 years old and had never been spoken and never been examined and had spent 2 decades disguising itself as conviction. He had lost a daughter to the cold. He had spent 20 years building walls against that lost walls so high and so thick that he had confused them for wisdom. And when he saw Clara digging her tunnel, a mother, a child, an unproven idea, he had seen not a woman with a solution, but the specter of his own failure reaching forward through time towards someone else's child. His cruelty had been real. Its consequences had been real. But its source was not malice. It was the terrible, misdirected love of a man who had never found a way to grieve. "You wanted to protect Owen," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and even. "I understand that." The words were not absolution. They were not forgiveness offered as a transaction, a debt cleared, a slate wiped. They were something rarer. They were recognition. She was telling him that she saw him, not the man on the horse, not the authority figure who had wielded the community like a weapon, but the father who had hacked a child's grave out of frozen ground and had never fully come back from it. Elias turned. His eyes were bright and his jaw was working. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement that contained more emotion than any words he could have assembled, and then he opened the door and walked out into the brilliant, blinding white of the aftermath. Nate lingered. He stood by the table for a moment, looking at the journal, at the sketches he had made. Then he looked at Clara across the small room. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching him." Clara shook her head. "The winter taught him. I only opened the door." Nate looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. A fraction of a smile quickly contained the smile of someone who has learned to hold good things carefully, having had them taken before. He folded his sketches and put them in his pocket and followed his father into the snow. By the middle of the afternoon, others had come. Pruitt arrived first, sheepish and frostbitten, carrying himself with the quality of a man who has been wrong in public and is in the process of deciding how to hold that fact. He said very little. He sat by the stove and accepted a cup of hot water and looked at his hands. Reverend Cade came an hour later on foot, having made the walk from the church through drifts that reached his waist in places. He arrived breathing hard and stood in the doorway with his Bible tucked under one arm and the expression of a man whose framework for understanding the world has just been comprehensively rearranged and is not yet sure what to replace it with. After him came a family Clara knew only slightly, a husband and wife and their 2 children, the youngest of whom, a boy of about 5, had not spoken since the storm began. He was carried in his father's arms, eyes open and unfocused, body present, but something essential somewhere else. The father's voice when he asked to come in was the voice of a man who has stopped having pride about anything. Clara brought them all in. She heated water. She distributed what she had not abundantly, but adequately, which was more than could be said for anywhere else in the valley that day. She organized the space with the efficient calm of someone who has been solving logistics problems in small areas for the better part of a year. The adults near the stove, the children on the bed, blankets redistributed, food put to warming. The cabin held 17 people by evening. Flint moved among them with the specific dignity of an animal who takes his responsibilities seriously. He allowed himself to be patted and did not snap or flinch. He found his way to each of the children and paused beside them long enough for small hands to reach his fur and then moved on. The small boy, the one who had not spoken, was sitting on the floor near the wall, separate from the other's knees pulled to his chest, eyes still carrying that quality of interior distance. His mother sat near him, but not touching him, understanding instinctively that the reaching she wanted to do would not help yet. Flint went and lay down beside him. He didn't push. He didn't put his head in the boy's lap or perform any gesture of deliberate comfort. He simply lay down close enough that his warmth was available, and breathed. The boy looked at him, a long, considering look. Then very slowly, he put one hand on Flint's flank. Flint's tail moved once, just once. The boy pressed his palm flat against the dog's side and felt the breathing, the steady, reliable rise and fall of something alive and warm and present. His own breathing changed. Something in his face that had been locked began to loosen. His lips moved. "Is the dog going to be all right?" he whispered. The room went quiet. Not the performed quiet of people trying not to disturb something, but the genuine quiet of people who have just heard something that has reached past their defenses. His mother put her hand over her mouth. His father turned away. "He's going to be fine," Clara said, Her voice was steady. "He's a very good dog." The boy kept his hand on Flint's side. Flint kept breathing, and after a while, the boy leaned sideways until his head was resting against the dog's back, and he closed his eyes. Night came with a sky full of stars, the extravagance of stars that appears only when the air has been cleaned by violence, when every particle of cloud and haze has been driven away, and the dark is as dark as it can be. Most of the people in the cabin slept. The space was small and warm and crowded with the intimacy of strangers who have survived something together and find themselves, without having planned it briefly, a community. Owen had appointed himself in charge of the children's corner. He sat cross-legged on the floor with 3 of them arranged around him. Pruitt's daughter, the silent boy who was no longer entirely silent, and a small girl from the family Clara didn't know, and he was showing them how his soldiers were organized, not playing exactly, explaining. His voice was quiet and patient. Nate sat against the wall with his sketches spread on his knees, working by the light of the banked stove, refining his drawings. Clara watched him from the table and thought of Daniel's hand moving across the pages of his journals, the same precision, the same quality of attention, the same native fluency with angles and measurements. It was not identical. Nate would develop his own style, his own modifications, his own improvements. That was as it should be. Elias Holt sat near the stove and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for hours. He was the stillness of a man who is rebuilding something interior and has nothing left over for conversation. After the others had settled, after the breathing in the room had slowed and deepened into sleep, Silas Vane came and sat beside Clara at the table. He had arrived in the late afternoon with 2 other men from the mining claim, all of them storm-battered and grateful and saying very little. He had helped with the logistics of fitting 17 people into a small space with the practical competence Clara had come to expect from him, and then he had stepped back present without demanding presence available, without requiring acknowledgement. Now he sat beside her in the quiet of the sleeping room, and they both looked at the people arranged across every available surface of the small cabin. He did not speak for a long time. Clara did not require him to. Then he reached for the lamp that sat between them on the table, adjusting the wick which didn't need adjusting, and his hand passed close to hers. Not touching. Almost. She did not move her hand away. For a moment, the space between their hands was very small and very specific, and then he set the lamp back down, and the moment passed, but it passed the way a door closes, not locked, just closed, capable of being opened again. "He was right, you know," Silas said quietly. "Your husband, about all of it." "Yes," Clara said. "He was. You made it better." Clara looked at the sleeping boy across the room, at Owen's face in the firelight, relaxed in sleep utterly and completely, without the micro-tensions of waking. Flint lay across his feet. The boy who had not spoken was curled beside them, one hand still resting on Flint's side, still connected to that rhythm. "He gave me the foundation," she said. "I had to learn the rest." Silas nodded. He looked at the lamp. "That's true of most things worth building," he said. They sat in the warmth of the earth and the quiet of the sleeping valley and did not need to say anything else. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night, Owen cried out, not in distress in sleep, a single word spoken clearly into the dark. "Papa." Clara was awake immediately. She sat up and looked at her son across the room. He was still asleep, face, soft chest, rising and falling. Flint had lifted his head and was looking at Owen with amber eyes, then looked at Clara, then lowered his head back to his paws. Clara rose quietly and crossed the room. She lay down beside Owen on the narrow space the children shared, one hand placed gently on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against her palm. He did not wake. He did not call out again. He simply breathed. Clara lay in the dark of the cabin with her son's heartbeat under her hand, and the warmth of the earth rising through the floor below them, and the sound of 17 people sleeping. And she thought about Daniel, not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, with the specific, complicated tenderness of someone who has loved a person deeply and learned finally to carry that love without being crushed by it. He had given her the blueprint. He had trusted her with the inside of his mind, with the idea that everyone else had dismissed, because he had known with the quiet certainty of a man who paid attention to what the earth was telling him that she was the only one who would build it. She had built it. And it was holding. Outside, the valley lay under its deep white silence, and the stars burned close and cold and brilliant, and beneath the frozen ground the earth held its steady temperature, patient, unwavering, keeping the promise it had always kept, the promise that summer is never entirely gone. That warmth once given to the deep ground is not lost, only waiting to be asked for. The people left in ones and twos over the course of the morning as the valley dug itself out. They left the way people leave after surviving something together quietly, without the social choreography of ordinary departures, without the usual performance of farewell. A nod, a hand briefly pressed, a look that contained more than could be said. Pruitt left without speaking, which said more than any speech he could have given. The family Clara didn't know, the husband and wife, and their 2 children, left last the small boy, walking on his own feet, now one hand in his mother's, the other trailing along Flint's back until the distance between them grew too large to bridge. Flint watched him go from the porch. His tail moved slowly once, and then he sat down and watched the figures diminish across the white landscape until they were gone. Reverend Cade was the second to last. He stood in the doorway in his coat and hat, and held his Bible in both hands, and looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man whose map of the world has been revised and who is still in the process of orienting himself to the new geography. "I thought you needed saving," he said. "It appears you are the one who should be saving us." He did not mention Owen. He did not mention the church council or the formal request he had been preparing to make. He simply did not mention them, and his silence on those subjects was the most complete statement he was capable of making. Clara held the door. "The tunnel will be here," she said, "if anyone wants to understand how it works." Cade nodded once and walked out into the snow. The reckoning with Old Cutter came 3 days later, when the drifts had settled enough for travel and the valley had begun the slow, effortful process of assessing what the storm had taken. What it had taken from Old Cutter was everything. He had been found the morning after the storm broke by a neighbor who had gone to check on him, guided by the absence of smoke from his chimney. He was in his chair by the cold hearth, his hands in his lap, gone quietly, sometime in the deep of the second night. The fire had burned out. The wood had run out before it. He had not gone for help. He had not come to Clara's door. He had sat in his conviction and his independence and his 40 years of knowing better than anyone else, and the storm had simply collected what he had refused to yield. Clara heard the news from Pruitt, who told her with the flat tone of a man who has already processed his own role in the sequence of events and found it uncomfortable to hold. She stood in her yard and looked at the low mound of the tunnel crossing the earth between her cabin and her barn, and she did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel the satisfaction of a woman whose warnings had been proven right by the worst possible evidence. She felt the weight of it, the specific, irreversible weight of a death that did not need to happen, that had been preventable, that had been refused at every available point of prevention. Old Cutter had laughed the loudest. He had also been the most alone. Those two facts sat together in her chest and did not resolve into anything clean. Owen found her standing in the yard and came to stand beside her. He looked at the tunnel mound, then at her face. "Did someone not make it?" he asked. "Old Cutter," Clara said. Owen was quiet for a moment. "He was on the betting list," he said, not as a judgment, as a fact. "Yes." Another silence. "Did he have anyone?" "No," Clara said. "He lived alone." Owen looked at the mound. He looked at the direction of Old Cutter's property, invisible beyond the ridge. "That's the saddest part," he said. "Not the being wrong, the being alone." Clara looked at her son, at the gray eyes steady and clear, arriving at a truth that had taken her considerably longer to reach. She put her hand briefly on the top of his head. "Yes," she said. "That's the saddest part. The betting list itself had been destroyed by the storm. The paper it was written on had been saturated by the drifts and dried to an unreadable pulp. When the board outside Pruitt's store was cleared and cleaned in the early spring, there was nothing left to remove. Pruitt brought Clara a sack of flour and a wheel of hard cheese delivered without comment on a Tuesday morning set on her porch step, and walked away from, before she could formalize the moment, into something he would have had to acknowledge directly. It was not by any objective measure an apology, but it was a form of recognition, the recognition of a man who settles debts, even debts he has never explicitly acknowledged owing. Clara put the flour and the cheese in the pantry. It was enough. The spring came the way it always comes to that kind of country, reluctantly, in fits and starts. 2 warm days, followed by a freeze, the snow retreating, and then advancing again, like something that hasn't fully decided to leave. But it came. Marta Gould came with it. She appeared at the cabin on a morning in late winter when the first patches of brown earth were beginning to show through the thinning snow, and the creek had started to run again beneath its ice. She stood on the porch with a jar of preserves in her hands, the same kind of jar she had placed on this same porch step months before, and walked away from. Her face held an expression Clara had never seen on it, a mixture of shame and stubbornness, and something that might with generous interpretation be called courage. "I was wrong, Clara," she said. 3 words. They hung between the 2 women in the mild late winter air, and the space they occupied was large, because those 3 words had to travel a considerable distance across the gap between the person Marta had been when she walked away and the person she was attempting to be now. Clara looked at her for a long time. The jar of preserves sat between them, the same kind of jar, the same porch step, a different woman holding it. Or perhaps the same woman trying. The gap between who Marta had been and who she was attempting to be was real and could not be crossed by 3 words alone. But 3 words was a beginning. And Clara, who had built 100 feet of tunnel 1 stone at a time, understood the value of beginnings. "Come in and have some tea, Marta," she said. Marta stepped inside. They sat at the table and drank tea and talked about the garden, about what Clara planned to plant in the spring, about the quality of the seed stock, about which of the preserved vegetables had held well through the winter and which had not. They talked about small, ordinary things, and the ordinariness was itself a kind of bridge, narrow and provisional, spanning a gap that might never fully close, but sufficient for crossing. Elias Holt began digging in April. The ground had thawed enough to accept a shovel by the time he started, and he started the way he did everything, with total commitment, without ceremony, with the full physical intensity of a man who expresses himself most fluently through labor. He worked every day from first light until the light failed. Nate worked beside him. Clara went to the Holt property twice a week to advise. This was the thing that the valley found most remarkable, not the tunnel itself, not the sight of the most successful rancher in the territory bent over a shovel, but the sight of Elias Holt listening. Standing in his own trench, while a young widow pointed to the earth and explained what it could do, and nodding and adjusting and doing it differently than he had done it before. People stopped their wagons on the track to watch. He connected the house to the cattle barn first, then to the workshop. By the following winter, his homestead was a network of underground passages, a quiet subterranean civilization that moved the heat of his animals through the earth and distributed it gently and evenly through everything above. He never spoke to Clara about Lily. She never asked him to. Some things are given back to the person who carries them to be held or released as they see fit without anyone else's involvement. What he did instead was step back. He stepped back from Nate. Nate had a gift, a natural, unforced fluency with angles and measurements, and the spatial relationships between things that his father had spent 17 years inadvertently suppressing by filling every available space with his own certainty. The gift had survived anyway, the way things that belong to a person always survive, waiting in the margins for the room to emerge. Now there was room. Nate began drawing plans for the neighbors, adapting the tunnel design to different terrain, different foundation types, different configurations of house and barn and workshop. He developed modifications that Clara hadn't thought of solutions to problems she hadn't encountered. He brought them to her, and they talked through them, and she recognized in those conversations the specific pleasure of watching someone learn to think independently and well. Once Nate sent Owen a letter with a sketch so elegant and so different from anything Daniel had drawn that Owen sat with it for a long time before writing back. When he did, he wrote only 4 words. Papa would have argued. Nate's reply came 3 weeks later, just as brief, and then he would have dug. Watching Nate's careful hand move across the paper, the same precision, the same patient attention to detail, Clara felt something complete itself. A circle whose opening she had not been aware of until it began to close. Daniel had seen the answer. He had trusted Clara with it. Clara had built it and proven it, and survived because of it. And now Nate was taking it further than either of them had imagined. That was what knowledge was supposed to do. Not stay where it was placed. Move. Silas Vane stayed. Not at Clara's cabin. He had his own place, a modest claim on the valley's eastern edge that he worked with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. But he stayed in the valley when the work at the old mining site concluded, and there was no practical reason to remain. He stayed and found reasons to be useful, and the reasons were real. He had skills the valley needed, and he applied them without drama. He came to Clara's regularly. He came more often than practicality required, and they both understood this, and neither of them felt the need to discuss it. Owen accepted his presence with the casual ease of a child who has observed something for long enough that it has simply become part of the landscape. He showed Silas his soldiers. He showed him the tunnel. He asked him questions about mining, about what it was like underground, about what you could tell from the way rock sounded when you tapped it, about whether Papa's journals made sense to someone who had actually worked in a mine. Silas answered each question with the same direct attention he brought to everything Owen said. On a mild evening in the late spring, Silas was sitting on the porch step when Owen came out of the barn and walked past him without stopping and said entirely without preamble, "You should just stay." Then he went inside. Silas sat on the step for a moment. Then he looked up at the window where Clara was visible through the glass, her back to him, preparing supper, pretending very effectively not to have heard. He almost smiled. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and eventually the mornings accumulated into something that no longer required a name. The thing that spread through that valley, and then the next, and eventually much further, was never called a technique. It was never formalized or written down in any official way, at least not at first. It spread the way things spread when they have been proven by the most persuasive evidence available, which is survival. People saw that Clara's animals had come through the winter healthy. They saw that her the woodpile everyone had declared inadequate, had lasted through the worst storm in living memory, with room to spare. They saw Elias Holt, a man whose opinion had always carried the weight of settled fact, listening to a young widow explain the temperature of deep earth. And they began to dig. They called the passages by various names in various places. In Clara's valley, they were called marsh passages, a name that emerged without anyone deciding on it, the way natural names emerged by simple repetition among people who needed something to call a thing they talked about often. The story that accompanied the name was told differently by different people, as stories always are. But its center stayed the same. A woman who had listened when the world told her to be deaf. A woman who had gone down when every voice told her to build up. A woman who had found the answer not by fighting what was against her, but by understanding what was already there and learning to ask it for what she needed. The evening that Clara thought of most in the years that followed was not the night of the storm. It was not the morning Elias Holt knocked on her door or the afternoon she wrote in Daniel's journal. It was a quiet evening in late spring when the valley had turned green and the creek was running full and the air carried the first real warmth of the year. Owen was in the barn doing his evening rounds with Flint at his heels. Clara was on the porch. The light was doing what late spring light does in that country, lingering past its welcome, softening into gold, and then amber, and then a rose that had no name. She was not thinking about anything particular. She was watching the low mound of earth that crossed her yard, the gentle ridge, barely visible anymore, sown over with new grass that had grown up through the spring and integrated the tunnel's presence into the surface of the land as though it had always been there. Owen came out of the barn with Flint beside him and walked across the yard and held out his hand. In it was an egg. "Nell gave extra milk today," he said, "and one of the new hens laid in the wrong spot. I found it behind the grain sacks." Clara took the egg. She held it in her palm, smooth and warm, the specific warmth of something recently alive, recently made. She looked at the yard, at the grass growing over the tunnel, at the sky going slowly gold above the ridgeline. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the evening didn't already know. Owen stood beside her for a moment, then sat down on the porch step. Flint arranged himself across both their feet. They sat together in the fading light, the three of them, and the valley was quiet around them, and the earth beneath them held its steady temperature, patient, unwavering, keeping the promise it had always kept. This was what remained after there was nothing left to prove. This ordinary, irreplaceable evening. This egg. This dog. This boy with his father's hands and his mother's patience and his own particular way of understanding the world. This was what she had dug for. The seasons that followed were quieter than the one that had preceded them. Not empty, full in fact, of the ordinary work of living the garden planted and harvested. The tunnel maintained and improved the valley, slowly learning to dig, but quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after a long storm when the world is simply itself again, without the heightened intensity of survival. Then one autumn morning, several years later, when the frost had come back to silver, the grass and Flint had grown old in the way that good dogs grow old slowly, with dignity, without complaint, Owen found him in the morning in his usual place beside the stove. He had slowed over the preceding months in the gradual dignified way of old dogs sleeping more. Moving with greater deliberateness, spending his afternoons in the particular patch of sun that moved across the porch floor over the course of the day, following it from one end to the other with patient steps. His eyes had stayed bright. His tail had continued its slow, contented movement whenever Owen came near. He had remained until very close to the end, fully himself. He was already gone. The expression on his face was the expression of an animal that had decided in its own time and in its own way that everything was settled and in order. They buried him at the edge of the yard beside the entrance to the tunnel, beside the place he had run to first on the night Clara had led Owen through the completed passage. For the first time, the place where he had stood, with his tail sweeping the air, waiting for them to emerge, as though he had already known what was on the other side. Owen made the marker himself from a flat piece of creek stone. He worked on it for 2 evenings with a chisel and a focused expression that did not invite conversation. When it was done, it said, "Flint, he knew before we did." They stood beside it for a while, the three of them, Clara, Owen, and Silas, who had been there long enough now that his presence at the important moments had become simply a fact of their life. Nobody spoke. The autumn light was long and amber, and the valley was beginning its turn toward the season that had once been the thing Clara feared most in the world. It was not that any more. It had not been that for a long time. In the years that followed, Owen grew into a man with his father's hands, and something of both his parents in the way he moved through the world, Daniel's precision, Clara's patience, and a quality that belonged entirely to himself, a kind of quiet confidence in the relationship between work and understanding. He became a builder. Not merely of structures, though he built those too, with a skill that drew people from neighboring valleys to seek his advice. He became someone people came to when they had a problem they couldn't see their way out of, when the conventional approaches had failed and they needed someone who would look at the situation differently. He always started by asking the same question. What's already there that we haven't listened to yet? Nate Holt, who had become, over the years, something close to a brother, in the way that people who share formative years and intellectual kinship become, would have recognized the question immediately. He had built his own practice around a version of it, drawing plans for homesteads across the territory that worked with the earth rather than against it. He and Owen collaborated sometimes. They sent each other letters with sketches in the margins. They argued productively and settled their arguments by testing things and observing what happened. It was Clara thought the way Daniel would have wanted his work to continue, not preserved in amber, not kept as it was, but used, improved, passed forward. One evening late in her life, Clara opened the chest again. She did this rarely now, not because the grief had faded. It had not faded exactly. It had simply changed its nature over the years, the way materials change under sustained pressure, becoming something denser and more stable than what they had been. She opened the chest rarely, because the chest had become by now more than Daniel's. It had become the record of a conversation that had begun with his handwriting and continued with hers, and would continue after her when Owen opened it himself. She turned to the last page of the third journal. Her handwriting was beside his, now her rounder, bolder script beside his neat, angular hand occupying the margin he had left blank. He was right. Below it, his words. The fire is a frantic temporary gift. The earth is the source. It does not give its warmth freely, but it holds it forever. We must not fight the cold. We must bargain with the heat that is already there. She sat with the journal in her lap for a long time. Outside, the valley was settling into its evening quiet. The creek ran its perpetual conversation with the stones in its bed. Somewhere in the barn, Nell's successor, Nell had been gone for years, replaced by a younger cow with her mother's calm eyes shifted in her stall. The grass over the tunnel mound had gone gold with the season, and in the last of the light it looked almost luminous, as though the warmth it covered were visible from above. Clara closed the journal. She held it against her chest. She thought about the winter. Not with fear. She had stopped feeling that particular fear so long ago that she could barely locate where it had once lived. She thought about it the way you think about something that taught you everything you know, with a respect that is also a kind of gratitude, even for the hardness of it. The earth does not forget the summer. She had learned that in the deepest, most literal way possible, had built the proof of it. With her own hands had felt it hold through the worst that winter could offer. Had watched it sustain not only her life and Owen's life, but 17 lives, had seen it spread from her yard outward through the valley and beyond, until the principle it represented had become simply part of how people in that country understood survival. Not by building higher, not by fighting harder, by listening to what was already there. She set the journal back in the chest. She closed the lid. She pressed her palm against the pine wood and felt the grain beneath her fingers, familiar as a handshake. Then she went to the porch and sat down in the last of the evening light, and the valley was spread out below her, green and gold and alive, and the earth beneath all of it held its steady temperature, patient, unwavering, remembering the summer. It always would. The earth does not forget the summer, and neither should you. Whatever storm you are facing right now, remember her. She did not build higher. She did not fight harder. She listened to what was already there. She went down when every voice told her to build up. She asked the earth for what it had always been willing to give, if only someone had thought to ask.